From the EXL Digital Studio, this is Smart Conversations with Nalin and Miglani.
Welcome everyone to another edition of Smart Conversations. Today's Smart Conversations happen in a very unusual time. In these times, we all feel vulnerable. And today's conversations will focus on vulnerability and mental health. We all feel vulnerable today for various reasons. We feel vulnerable for our groceries, for our jobs, for our health, maybe even for our life. It's a complex subject, and today we will deal with this in a way which can help us all, maybe even turn vulnerability into an advantage. To deal with this and to have a really smart conversation, I'm very fortunate to have with me a panel that is unusual too in these unusual times. Today's Smart Conversations will be joined by Garen Staglin, the chairman of our board, Deborah Kerr, member of EXL board, and Rohit Kapoor, the CEO of EXL. It is still an EXL panel, but people who can really help us deal with these complex times. Let me straight away start with Garen. Garen, how do you look at vulnerability, especially when it comes to an individual? How do you think about it, and how do you frame it in your mind?
So good morning, and thank you, Nalin, for the opportunity to address our teammates and others interested in what's happening here at EXL. You know, the word vulnerability is not a word that, as chairman of a public company, I normally use. We think more about shareholders, about long-term value. We think about strategy. We think about our associates. But vulnerability really comes from a time when we feel like we're not in control. We don't have the defenses or normal mechanisms that we usually have to cope. And that's a difficult thing. Our routines are disrupted, and there's uncertainty in our lives. So to address this, let's start by saying it's okay to feel this way. Recognize that, verbalize it, and get your feelings out. That's a good, best place to start. Try to get yourself centered again. And be sure you understand what is important. Do what you can control, and try not to let distractions or uncertainty, which you can't control, disrupt you. At EXL, we're trying to do our best to communicate our plans each day going forward, and even over-communicate so you can better see where your life is going and plan for the future. It is, however, easy to feel vulnerable, but try to remember what is important. For me personally, I was spending 50% of my time on an airplane, worrying about making this flight or that flight, being late for this meeting or that meeting. And when really the most important things was the pride in my work, my family, my health, and my grandchildren. So my net message is to reduce your vulnerability, keep your priorities straight, stay centered, and that's the best way for you to reduce vulnerability in these uncertain times.
Garen, that was really helpful, talking about vulnerability at an individual level. I want to now turn to Rohit on how he thinks about vulnerability at the level of a company. In these very difficult times, challenging times, Rohit, how have you perceived vulnerability as you lead EXL?
So Nalin, thank you for having me here. And the best way to make sure that you are safe and protected in a vulnerable environment is to make sure you've got a very smart board with you. And I am delighted with the smart people that we have on our board who help the entire organization stay safe and secure. A CEO is always trained to think about vulnerability because one is taught that you should be paranoid at every moment. And so you're constantly thinking about what are the things that can cause a risk for the business. But in this particular situation that we just experienced, it was a vulnerability where the risk was that of human life, of the personal safety of our employees. And for me, when I think about vulnerability at EXL, I think about vulnerability at the EXL family, because we all have this culture within us that we think about EXL and every member of EXL as being a family. And so for me, it was, how should we be trying to protect ourselves in this kind of an environment where there may be a risk to our people and to our business model, and what should we do about it?
The metaphor of family has helped you, Rohit, really to deal with these challenging times in leading EXL. I wonder if this metaphor can even apply at the highest level to society at large. I want to turn to you, Deborah, for the toughest question. How do you perceive vulnerability as you sit on the board of a very big company and almost an industry? How do you perceive vulnerability for the world at large?
Nalin, thank you very much for the hard question, and importantly, thank you for the opportunity to be with you and Garen and with Rohit. As you said, as it relates to travel, certainly as an industry, it is going through an unprecedented impact with volume declines of greater than 90% due to lockdowns and quarantines and really consumer fear. When you think about the impact of fear, there are two natural reactions to that. One is to do nothing and perhaps to hunker down and try to wait it out. And the other is to look for opportunities to achieve better outcomes. I think what we've seen across all levels, and this is not just in travel, but across all sectors and geographies, focusing first and foremost on employee safety and health, thinking about the impact to consumers and the customers that we serve, and thinking about the supply chain and the key suppliers that we work with. It takes a lot to keep this kind of industry going, and it certainly has been rocked back on its heels by how we're having to operate today. I think there are a number of things that we're doing to try and address that, clearly around keeping employees safe, keeping them engaged, and trying to keep them productive in this type of environment. Making sure that we're going through scenario planning to understand things like liquidity and how to deal with a very capital intensive industry like travel, and how we can address that and deal with it. And at the same time, think about business continuity and risk management.
The idea of hunkering down, Deborah, the one that you mentioned, what does it do to our selves, our mental health? And Garen, you've been passionate about mental health. You've been writing about it. I've been reading your blogs. It'd be a good time for us to now talk about how to deal with our personal well-being, and in particular, how to deal with mental health as we hunker down.
When I think about mental health, I use the term brain health at the same time, because I think it's important for us all to know that our brain is the most complicated organ in our body, but it's not a separate organ. Without brain health, you really can't have heart health or any other kind of health. We say there's no health without brain health or mental health. So we should all recognize that each day, each of us is on a different spectrum of our brain health. Some days are better, some days are not so good, some days are great. And in these uncertain times, we're certainly having more not so good days. So to face the stresses and strains that we have, I've got some ideas for how we can all have a better spectrum on where we are in our own brain health. Those things are structure, pride and purpose, and wellness. Let's begin. Structure, even though we're working at home, means to get a routine and stick with it. Get up in the morning or evening, depending on what hours of the day you're working, get dressed, and go to work just like you are at your own workplace. And as best as possible, avoid distractions. I know you may have dogs, kids, or family members around, but try to avoid those distractions. Secondly, don't overwork. You've got a lot more hours in the day because you're not traveling, but don't burn yourself out with too much work and allow yourself to get to a worn down condition. Pride and sense of purpose is also important to brain health. Celebrate the pride and the work that you're doing. And finally, I would say to maximize your brain health, you need to maximize your wellness. And how you should do that, you should understand that there are several chemicals in your body that you can help positively influence. One of those is dopamine. The other one is endorphins. You may have heard of these two, but let me give you some tips. First, endorphins comes from exercise. So I want to ask you to do every day at least a little bit, even if it only means getting up, walking around a bit during the middle of your day. I try to get up every morning at 5 or 6 a.m. and work out before my day starts, because if I don't, I know I won't get there. That's endorphins. The other thing is dopamine. So dopamine is a chemical which improves how you feel, your ability to feel positive, etc. You can generate dopamine by what you eat and how you think about things. So you can stimulate dopamine by eating more fish, less fried foods, more healthy vegetables, all the things you know you're supposed to do, but maybe you don't have time to do it. The other thing that when working at home to avoid is those snacks that are probably too close to you, then too easy to get. Try to avoid those. I think you all know what I'm talking about. And the other thing I would say is avoid overusing those things that make you feel a little more comfortable. Maybe like smoking, maybe like a nice glass of wine or drinking. Please try to modulate those things. And finally, let me say that meditation and mindfulness is another way to keep your brain chemicals in balance. Practice this every day. So think about these things and your wellness. This will lead to better productivity. It'll lead to an improved sense of pride in your work. And the most important thing for me, and I hope for you, is the ability for you to celebrate and enjoy your family and friends. This is what I practice, and I hope you will remember and do these things too.
Thank you, Garen, for those really strong and healthy recommendations. I do think this idea about brain health is certainly new for me, but very helpful. I want to stay on the spectrum of brain health at the highest level if possible, but also the notion of pride and a sense of purpose. Rohit, these two notions, pride and a sense of purpose, are they valuable for you when you lead EXL in these times?
So Nalin, the way I see it is everything that Garen spoke about, which applies to an individual level, you can actually extrapolate that and apply this at the organization level. I think there is a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, and there are many things which are unknown. And by the way, everybody expects the CEO to know all the answers, and I don't know all the answers. So how do you deal with this kind of a situation? And here's what I've learned. I've learned that if you can communicate the things that you do know and that you can control and lay a foundation of where the company is, what are the likely ways in which things are going to play out, and share that with the broader organization, that provides a huge amount of stability and comfort for everybody to know what the ground reality is. And you've got to share this in a very transparent and a very, and over-communicate this message to the employee base so that they are fully in alignment with you. The next thing really is about the purpose, and I'll just relate that because for our company, we have our own purpose, which we've said very clearly. And our purpose is to make sure that we look deeper, find a better way, and make our clients successful. So we need to anchor ourselves on that fundamental philosophy as to what is it that we should be doing to help our clients be successful. We need to do that in a way where we maintain the integrity of our company's culture and our character. And that is built around the principle of making sure that every single employee at EXL is important, is valuable, and we need to work together as a team, and we need to collaborate together as a team. So really, when you set down this foundation and you list out some of these principles that you're going to take decisions by, your job becomes easier. And as I've done this, in this particular situation, I've found that more and more people within EXL have embraced taking these decisions and have collaborated so that we are all participating in the decision making together, rather than this being something which one individual thought of and is cascading down. So we have this concept of a distributed leadership, which is completely non-hierarchical. And that is the kind of structure that works best in this kind of a volatile environment.
Rohit, your answer actually reminded me of a blog that Garen wrote at the start of this crisis. He wrote that in a time of crisis, our natural urge is to command and control. We should resist that. You talked about distributed leadership, the idea of expanding management with bringing everybody in. I would like to ask Deborah another tough question. When we deal with the larger world, do these concepts work? Many of us have been told, we read that in order to learn during these times, we refer back to the Second World War, earlier pandemics, when collective responses were required. What works, Deborah, when we deal with the world at large in this scenario?
So Nalin, thank you once again for the hard question. This, as we all know, has clearly been a major pandemic that has just impacted millions of lives on so many levels. You know, on the theme of vulnerability, which you've really had throughout this whole conversation, there are so many forms of that: physical, social, emotional, cyber. And if you think about how the world is adapting to the current circumstances today, it really has accelerated change in a very disruptive kind of way, in ways that folks might not have thought possible. Certainly not through some of the other events that you just highlighted from the past and how we are operating today, or that folks might have thought were decades still to come in terms of how we're dealing with them. You know, some examples around that, just think about the use of technology and how we today are all sitting here virtually having this conversation, and how we're having business interactions today. If you think about the role of technology in healthcare and what we're doing from a telemedicine perspective to continue the relationship between the patient and the provider, or on the topic of fitness and well-being, as Garen mentioned, you know, having that routine and leveraging technology to stream classes, whether it be for fitness or, you know, on the other end, how we think about education and distance learning and the online learning that's happening. You know, if you think about back to the earlier question you asked about travel as an industry and how we all spend our time interacting with colleagues or with customers or potential customers or friends and family, we've all collectively spent a lot of time on airplanes in various forms of travel to meet with people and spend time with them, oftentimes for a 1-hour meeting or a 1-day meeting. And, you know, we've all figured out pretty well how to operate in this environment today. And it's also had the benefit of having a tremendous impact on the climate and the overall environment. And certainly lessons from that that we should all take from that, and understanding that we have a lot of control over some of these factors. And finally, the last thing, Nalin, that I would say is I think that, you know, as we look to maximize the near term and as we position for recovery, I think it's about adapting to the market and to customer or consumer conditions and looking for opportunities to look at what a better new normal looks like and not going back to the way that it was. And I think that we will see much more focus on trends such as automation and robotics and drones, decoupling of the supply chain, how we leverage technology to take some of these things further around areas like education and healthcare. So I'm actually quite excited about the new normal and achieving those better outcomes and figuring out how to do that in a much smarter way and learning from everything that we've all lived through in the last few months.
Wow, that is a really powerful insight, Deborah. The notion that after this crisis, we will emerge in a better world. That even during this crisis, many things are happening that will help us create a better world going forward. You talked about education, healthcare, and that may lead to a better world. Indeed, I think you're saying it will lead to a better world.
Absolutely.
So this actually may be a good point to close today's Smart Conversation. An immensely useful conversation in a very difficult time. But I have learned a lot. Garen, I want to be, like I said before, on the highest level of brain health. Rohit, your notion of distributed leadership. And above all, thank you, Deborah, for pointing out the number of positive things that might come out of this crisis. The bluer skies, the cleaner air, more education. And I think I would like to hope, along with everyone, that this will bring us to a better world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we look forward together to bring to you another useful Smart Conversations.
That was today's Smart Conversation. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope you have a great week. Smart Conversations is a co-production from Nalin Miglani and our EXL communication team.